Did you know that one of the greatest bishops in Christian history was not even baptized when the people chose him to lead their church? That a Roman governor, trained in law and rhetoric, walked into a cathedral to keep the peace during a violent election dispute, and walked out 8 days later as a bishop, having been baptized, ordained, and consecrated in a single breathless week? While his name is less known today than the man he baptized, Augustine, Saint Ambrose, shaped Western Christianity in ways we still experience every time we sing a hymn in church or expect our leaders to answer to a higher law. How did an unbaptized politician become one of the 4 original doctors of the Church? How did he find the courage to bar the most powerful emperor in the world from receiving communion until he repented for the massacre? And why does his story still matter to anyone who believes that truth must be spoken to power? This is the story of Saint Ambrose, the reluctant bishop who tamed emperors with truth, who proved that moral courage outweighs political strength, and who showed the world that even those who wear crowns must kneel before God. The year was 374, and Milan, then the effective capital of the Western Roman Empire, was tearing itself apart. The bishop had died, and 2 factions were at war over his successor. Arians, who denied the full divinity of Christ, clashed with those who upheld the Nicene Creed. Voices rose, fists followed. The ancient basilica echoed with shouts that had nothing to do with prayer. Into this chaos walked Ambrose, the Roman governor of the region. He was 35 years old, a man of noble birth and classical education, trained in rhetoric and law. His father had served as Praetorian prefect of Gaul before dying young, leaving the family to return to Rome. Ambrose had risen through the imperial civil service with quiet competence, earning a reputation for justice and measured judgment. He came to the cathedral that day not as a candidate but as a peacekeeper. His role was simple: prevent bloodshed, restore order, and allow the election to proceed. He stood before the crowd and spoke with the calm authority that had served him well in courtrooms and councils. Then something happened that no one could explain. A child's voice, some say it was a child, others an angel, rang out through the tumult. "Ambrose for bishop." The crowd fell silent. Then, as if moved by a single breath, both factions began to chant together. Arians and Nicenes, moments ago ready to kill each other, now united in one cry: "Ambrose for bishop, Ambrose for bishop." He tried to flee. He protested that he was unworthy, unqualified, and he was not even baptized, merely a catechumen preparing for the sacrament. He attempted to disqualify himself through staged scandals. He hid in a friend's villa, but the people would not be denied, and the emperor himself confirmed the election. Within 8 days, Ambrose was baptized, ordained through every clerical rank, and consecrated bishop of Milan. The governor had become a shepherd. The man of law had become a man of grace. The morning after his consecration, Ambrose rose before dawn and did something that would define his episcopate. He began to study. He knew rhetoric, philosophy, and Roman law, but theology was a foreign country. If he were to lead souls, he must first learn how. He gave away his wealth to the poor. His sister Marcellina, a consecrated virgin in Rome, received his family's properties. He embraced episcopal poverty with the same discipline he had once applied to imperial administration. His household became austere, his table simple, his door always open to those in need. Then he turned to the Greek fathers, Origen, Basil, and Athanasius, whose works became his daily bread. He read through the night, candles burning low, filling his mind with the wisdom of those who had defended the faith before him. What he lacked in formal theological training, he compensated for with relentless study and the rhetorical brilliance of his Roman education. Within months, the governor who had stammered excuses about his unworthiness was preaching sermons that drew crowds from across the empire. His voice, trained to argue cases before magistrates, now proclaimed the mysteries of Christ with clarity and power. His allegorical interpretations of Scripture opened hidden depths. His explanations of doctrine cut through Arian confusion like light through fog. The Arian heresy, which had seemed poised to capture Milan, began to retreat, not through imperial edict or political maneuvering, but through the simple power of truth well spoken. Ambrose had discovered that the skills of a Roman advocate could serve the gospel. The courtroom had prepared him for the pulpit, and the congregation of Milan, watching their unlikely bishop grow in wisdom week by week, began to understand that God's preparation often looks nothing like what we expect. 12 years into his episcopate, Ambrose faced his greatest test of courage. The Empress Justina, mother of the young Emperor Valentinian II, was an Arian. She demanded that Ambrose surrender one of Milan's basilicas for Arian worship. Imperial soldiers surrounded the church. The message was clear: comply or face the consequences. Ambrose refused. He gathered his congregation inside the basilica and prepared for siege. Day after day, week after week, they remained within the walls while soldiers stood guard outside. The tension was unbearable. Fear spread through the faithful. Some whispered that resistance was futile. What could unarmed Christians do against imperial might? Then, Ambrose did something extraordinary. He taught the congregation to sing. Drawing on Eastern Christian traditions, he introduced antiphonal singing, two groups responding to each other in musical prayer. He composed hymns himself, simple melodies with profound words that ordinary people could memorize and sing together. The ancient walls, built for Roman oratory, now resonated with the voices of common believers, lifting their hearts to God. The soldiers outside heard the singing. Day after day, night after night, the hymns continued. The sound carried through the streets of Milan, not the noise of riot or rebellion, but the peaceful strength of faith expressed in music. The congregation, which had entered the basilica in fear, discovered something unexpected: courage, born of worship. In singing together, they became one body, one voice, one defiance that required no weapons. Justina backed down. The basilica remained in Orthodox hands. And the church discovered a truth it would never forget: that congregational singing is not mere decoration but spiritual warfare. That ordinary believers lifting their voices together can resist powers that seem invincible. To this day, the Ambrosian rite is still celebrated in Milan, and the hymn tradition he founded echoes in every congregation that sings its faith. In the year 384, a young professor of rhetoric arrived in Milan. His name was Augustine, and he was 30 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and spiritually lost. He had followed the Manichaean heresy for nearly a decade. He lived with a concubine and their son. His mother, Monica, had wept oceans of tears for his conversion, but Augustine remained unmoved by her pleas. He came to Milan for professional advancement, not spiritual awakening. But someone told him that the bishop was worth hearing, a former governor whose sermons combined intellectual depth with rhetorical mastery. Curious, Augustine began attending Ambrose's preaching. At first, he came as a critic, analyzing technique rather than receiving truth, but something began to shift. Ambrose's allegorical interpretations unlocked passages of Scripture that Augustine had dismissed as crude or contradictory. The bishop's explanations of Christian doctrine addressed philosophical objections that had troubled Augustine for years. Week after week, the young professor found his intellectual defenses crumbling. Ambrose himself was too busy to spend much time with Augustine personally. The pastoral demands of Milan consumed his days, but his preaching did the work that private conversation could not. Through sermons alone, Augustine's mind began to open. Through the witness of a bishop who combined learning with holiness, the restless heart glimpsed the possibility of peace. The famous conversion in the Milan garden came in 386. Augustine heard the child's voice. "Take and read," opened the scriptures, and surrendered at last. The following Easter, 387, Ambrose baptized Augustine along with his son Adeodatus and his friend Alypius. The waters of that font in Milan would flow outward to shape Western civilization, for Augustine would become the most influential theologian in church history. But behind Augustine's achievement stands Ambrose, the bishop who preached, the shepherd who planted seeds without knowing what harvest would come, the voice that reached a brilliant mind when no argument could reach the hardened heart. The year was 390, and Emperor Theodosius I ruled the Roman world. He was a Christian emperor, a defender of Nicene orthodoxy, a man who had done much good for the church. But in the city of Thessalonica, a riot had broken out. The people had murdered an imperial general. Theodosius, consumed by rage, ordered revenge. 7,000 people died in the massacre. Men, women, children, slaughtered in the hippodrome by imperial troops. Many were innocent, caught in a trap from which there was no escape. When word reached Milan, the Christian world recoiled in horror. Ambrose faced an impossible situation. This was no pagan persecutor, but a baptized Christian, a friend of the church, the most powerful man on earth. What could a bishop do? He did what no bishop had ever done before. Ambrose wrote to the emperor privately, warning him not to approach the altar until he had repented. When Theodosius came to Milan and attempted to enter the cathedral, Ambrose met him at the door and barred his way. The emperor of Rome, surrounded by guards and courtiers, was told he could not receive communion. He was excommunicated until he performed public penance for public sin. The standoff lasted months. Theodosius, furious at first, was forced to confront the weight of what he had done. Gradually, something broke within him. He removed his imperial purple, dressed in sackcloth, and stood at the church doors as a penitent. He wept publicly for his crime. He submitted to the judgment of the church. When Ambrose finally readmitted him to communion, a precedent had been established that would echo through the centuries. The emperor is within the church, not above it. Even crowns bow before the cross. Even the mightiest must answer to moral law. This single act, a bishop standing in a doorway, refusing entry to an emperor, changed the relationship between church and state forever. The final years of Ambrose's life were marked by continued preaching, writing, and pastoral care. He composed theological treatises, biblical commentaries, and letters that would guide the church for generations. He mentored young clergy, comforted the grieving, and defended the poor. His door remained open to all who sought counsel. He died on April 4, 397, in the city he had served for 23 years. He was approximately 57 years old, not ancient, but worn by decades of spiritual combat. The congregation that had acclaimed him in chaos now mourned him in peace. His body was laid to rest in the basilica he himself had built, Saint Ambrogio, where it remains to this day. Pilgrims still visit, still pray before the relics of the bishop who tamed emperors. The church named him one of the 4 original doctors of the Western Church, alongside Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. His influence shaped liturgy, hymnody, theology, and the very concept of church-state relations. The Ambrosian rite he developed still flourishes in Milan. The hymns he composed still echo in cathedrals and chapels around the world. Yet somehow, Ambrose remains less famous than Augustine, the man he baptized. Perhaps this is fitting. Ambrose never sought fame. He sought only to speak truth, defend the faith, and shepherd the souls entrusted to him. His glory was reflected. The light he kindled in Augustine shone brighter than his own. But for bishops facing political pressure, for leaders called to tasks they feel unprepared for anyone who wonders whether the Church should ever challenge the state, Ambrose stands as a witness. He proved that moral courage matters more than political power. He showed that even emperors must kneel. He demonstrated that the Church's independence is not a privilege, but a necessity. A Roman governor walked into a church to keep the peace. The crowd shouted his name. 8 days later, an unbaptized politician had become a consecrated bishop. He gave away his wealth, studied through the night, preached sermons that converted Augustine, composed hymns that taught congregations to sing their faith, and stood in a doorway to bar an emperor until he repented for the massacre. The emperor knelt. The bishop remained standing, and 16 centuries later, the truth Ambrose proclaimed still echoes. Crowns bow before crosses, power answers to justice, and the Church must never be afraid to speak truth. To those who rule,